Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our show notes and pictures of our lovely guests over on the podcast page. It's great to have you here, listeners. Let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. If we haven't met before, my name is Pilar. I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, and you can find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com. I am today delighted to welcome Tammy Bjelland to the show. She's the founder and CEO of Workplaceless, and she's here specifically to talk to us about their new product, Placeless Coach. Hello, Tammy.
Hello, Pilar. I'm so excited to be here.
I am delighted to have you finally. I think the only other time I think I've had a real-time conversation with you was a couple of years ago, I think, when you were organizing an open session for coaches or something some time ago. Do you remember?
Yes. We hosted some facilitator meetups where we would come together and share ideas. And I think that was the last time that we saw each other in any kind of, a real way.
Yes, lots of other messages on LinkedIn and stuff, that was a lifetime ago. So we don't usually bring people specifically to talk about a product, but seeing as Placeless Coach is all about helping people and teams adopt asynchronous practices, then it seemed like a good idea to get behind the microphone so that, as well as me asking you what it's all about, Tammy, we could share it with the listeners. So I thought we could start by putting the new venture into your context, just so that listeners who are not familiar with your work and with Workplaceless, so that they know where it fits in. So, and also where we are in the global adoption of online collaboration at the moment. So first of all, can you share the origins of Workplaceless, your company, Tammy?
So I founded Workplaceless in 2017, so well before the pandemic, but
Yes.
Pilar, as you mentioned, many lifetimes ago, it seems. So my background originally was in academia. So when I left academia, I started working in ed tech, and that was actually my very first remote role. So that was back in 2011. And as I began and continued working in ed tech, I then expanded into corporate training and corporate learning and development and continued to work remotely. And as I was in that space and I was working on remote and hybrid teams, I realized that there were not many learning experiences dedicated to improving skills and behaviors in remote and hybrid individual contributors as well as managers. So in 2017, I started Workplaceless. And then the following year, we launched our flagship product, which is the remote work certification program. Mm-hmm. And then we launched our leadership program, which is Lead Placeless. And since then, we've launched several other programs that are e-learning and blended programs. So a mix of e-learning and live facilitated workshops, and then standalone workshops as well.
Excellent. So listeners, loads to check out if you're interested in any of that, in addition to Placeless Coach. So with all of that, so you've got your blended learning, your asynchronous online experiences, your real-time facilitation experiences as well. What is the specific need that you're filling then with Placeless Coach?
Yeah, so as we've all sort of lived through this really interesting time where many people are adopting remote work quickly, organizations are expanding their remote and hybrid work options, we're seeing more and more individuals as well as organizations really feel the effects of a rapid shift in where they work without shifting how they work. And so with that, you get symptoms like having too many video meetings, like back-to-back video meetings, getting interrupted all the time, because if you're sitting at home, you must be available at all times, feeling like you have to respond to everything as soon as possible, overworking and not respecting your own boundaries between your work life and your personal life. And then also wasting time trying to find information that you don't have readily accessible to you, because you don't want to interrupt other people and you can't find the answers that you're looking for. So when teams rapidly shift to a different type of working without really shifting how they work, this is when you come into all of these issues. And so one of the ways that teams can improve all of these symptoms is to improve the balance of synchronous and asynchronous communication. And for any listeners that are unclear about what that means, synchronous communication is communication that happens simultaneously. So when you send a message, the receiver, the recipient, receives it at the same time that you are emitting that message. So a live conversation, for instance, that Pilar and I are having right now, this is synchronous communication. But since it's being recorded and listeners will be listening to this on their own time, that's an example of asynchronous communication. And a lot of communication tools that we have and have a love-hate relationship with, like email and Slack, those are examples of asynchronous communication, where you send a message and the receiver doesn't necessarily receive that message at the same time, and they can respond, according to their schedule. So teams that have an imbalance of synchronous and asynchronous communication fall into habits of office-centric work cultures. So relying very heavily on live conversations instead of trying to determine more efficient and effective ways of communicating and collaborating.
I was nodding. I was nodding along. I was also thinking when you were saying about how if you're heavily skewed towards synchronous, you might be more office centric. I was listening to an interview the other day in the Spanish podcast, El Futuro del Trabajo, the Future for Work podcast with Eva Rimbau. And she was saying, we've got to change this culture of the hey you, as in the dubbing and the hey you. And it was making me think of that. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, how we are much more likely to then be office-centric, or actually how teams that were very much used to working closely together and being used to those constant interruptions between each other, which help them to work, then have had that very, very difficult time, of course, to then adopt it asynchronous, because it's really not in their DNA in a way.
Yeah. And it's hard. Async is very hard. It goes against many of the very ingrained practices that we have as an office work culture. It takes work. It takes work to develop those practices and to shift the mindset. And it takes work to really truly adopt the tools that make that long distance collaboration possible. So at Workplaceless, we talk about the 3 pillars of effective remote work, and that's mindset, infrastructure, and capability. And the mindset is usually the hardest thing to overcome, because when you think about adopting more async, it really is a mindset shift. It's questioning how you've always worked and whether that is the best way to work in order to achieve the outcomes that you want. So that mindset shift is really challenging. And then the capability shift is also challenging, because it really is a skill to be able to effectively shift meetings to a more async format, for instance. And then the infrastructure, the tools themselves, they're really necessary. A lot of times the conversations about async almost go immediately to the tools instead of those other pieces.
Yes.
And that's where people get really they get caught up right in the weeds of how the tool works and everything. But what should come first is the process itself. And that's what we mean when we say infrastructure is the tools, but then the processes that allow team members to use those tools effectively.
And one other thing to get me thinking as well, going back to mindset, I was watching a webinar from Mind Gym, which is a training company, and they were talking about the transformation into hybrid. And they were talking about how having a conversation about mindset in the team really helps transformations. And this is a transformation if we're starting to adopt more asynchronous work. So I think that I've always focused on the mindset and having that mindset, but it turns out that actually having the conversations around what mindset we're going to need in our team can be helpful.
Oh, it's helpful. And it's also so challenging, Pilar. We have this conversation with teams and it's really uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable even thinking that you need to shift your mindset for things to be successful, because it's not enough to just say, oh, hybrid is the way of the future and we want to reap the benefits of remote work. That's one piece of the mindset. But I would say it's not even the most important piece, right? The most important piece is understanding and committing to the fact that you have to change your own behaviors to demonstrate that commitment to that shift in mindset.
That's so important. You brought up that word discomfort because it's going to be uncomfortable. It's not just a question of learning how to use a tool and send some messages. It can be very, very icky. So before we come on to how Placeless Coach works, because you've gone into asynchronous, and I wanted to ask you, we're talking about discomfort, and of course some individuals and even some teams will finding a new balance of asynchronous with synchronous easier or more difficult. Have you noticed a particular type of personality, or maybe it's just mindset actually, of people who find it easier, or even teams that find it easier, some kind of work maybe that's best suited? So individuals and teams who may find it easier. It's a broad generalization.
Sure. So individuals that may not find it easier, but they're the ones that make the most progress towards shifting that balance, are definitely those that have adopted and live into a learning mindset or a growth mindset. They are open to learning new things. They're okay with failing. And they also fail in public. So they test out a new way of communicating and they ask for feedback. And if that feedback is negative, then they correct course, instead of trying something once and then saying, oh, well, this didn't work. We're going to give up. So that type of mindset is really going to help anyone who's going to shift the way that they work, whether they're adopting more async practices or they're trying to adopt some other change. So on an individual, that's the type of person that really does well with this shift. But in terms of other, generalizations, it would be hard to pinpoint because we've had, some people try to think about it as like a generational difference, and that has not been in the experience that we've had working with people, that's not been the case. We've had plenty of people who, are in older generations that have really seen the benefits of async and are making really great strides in making those changes. And we've also had people from younger generations who really struggle with the idea of not being in the office and not putting in that face time. So I think, the mindset overall is the most important factor in adopting or improving the balance of async and sync communication. And then on an organizational or team level, really has a lot to do with leadership and whether leadership themselves are committed to having those conversations about mindset and putting in the work on a individual level as well as on a team level to build that team-wide commitment to a new way of working.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm so glad again that you pointed out the generation thing because, that's my experience as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So let's go back then. So these are all the issues. And as you say, it's not easy to address this balance if you're not used to it. And so What is Placeless Coach then, and how does it work?
We identified this problem through our research with our clients, but also with many other people who had experienced this rapid shift to remote and hybrid working. And they all talked about the same issues. And a lot of these issues can be resolved with improving that balance of synchronous and asynchronous communication. I already mentioned that learning more async practices is challenging. And as a learning company, like we develop learning experiences that build skills to succeed in these digital environments, whether they are fully remote or hybrid. And this particular skill set of improving that balance of async and sync communication is a really challenging one to develop. It's very, complex, and it can be really overwhelming for teams. But the wonderful thing about async and improving that balance is that you can make tiny changes. And if you make them as an individual, and then you make them as a team, and then you make them as an organization, those tiny changes can have a really large impact. And it really has to do with changing your behavior. And we wanted to develop a learning experience that reflected what we were teaching in this learning experience. So that emphasis on async. So we needed an async modality to deliver this learning experience. And as I mentioned before, we have various programs that are blended. So we have e-learning, self-paced e-learning combined with live facilitated workshops. And for this particular set of skills, we really wanted to just focus on async. And we also really wanted for learners to not leave the communication platform that they are already in most of the day. So for most teams, that's Slack, Microsoft Teams, or WebEx Teams. Those are the three communication platforms that we've been focusing on. And so we wanted to be able to deliver those learning experiences to users or learners who are already doing work in those platforms. So Placeless Coach works with Slack, it works with WebEx Teams and Microsoft Teams, and it is an async skills coach that guides learners through how to develop those async skills. And so we provide micro-learning experiences as well as nudges. And those nudges are what drive the behavior change along with goal setting. So users create their own goals. We call them one tiny actions, and they focus on that tiny action. And that is how they change their own habits and behaviors and overall improve their asynchronous communication skills.
Wow, can you give us some examples? Because I am so curious about how it would work if I were using it. Maybe you said a nudge, and you also said something like a micro learning or something as well.
Yeah, so they're very tiny lessons. So
Yes.
Between 1 and 3 minutes long.
Mhm.
And so it's a mix of different content that learners either read or watch, and that micro-learning experiences provides guidance on how to make the changes that they need to change. For instance, in one of the first parts of the program, we talk about the time spent in synchronous meetings. So we have learners assess their current meeting attendance. They understand or they learn the best practices for attending meetings. And if they own any meetings, then they're given guidance on how to effectively design meetings that are the best use of people's time. And then they set a goal around that particular topic. So for instance, when it comes to reducing synchronous meeting time, it's limiting the number, they might limit the number of meetings they have that week. They might decline a meeting that doesn't require their active participation. If they own a meeting, they might choose to adapt a meeting that would have been synchronous and adapt it to an async model. So it's open to the learner what they want to focus on, but that becomes their goal that they work towards achieving. And then the learning content that's delivered to that learner is then geared towards that particular goal.
Wow. And how about the nudges that they get, that the coach
Oh yeah.
gives them?
So learners get reminders. So one of the things that we learned from our research is, the power of reminders. Like people know a lot of the things that they should be doing. Like Pilar, you and I both know we should be taking breaks, right? But at the end of the day, I know sometimes that those 4 5 minute breaks that I wanted to take, and I wanted to like go for a little walk outside, I often don't take them because I'm not reminded that I need to take them, and I get really caught up in my work. And so those nudges are reminders to follow through on the proven practices to improve asynchronous communication. So it might be to make sure to document a process that you replicate all the time, and you need to share with a team member. Or it might be a reminder to assess your meeting attendance for the coming week and see where you can minimize some of your synchronous meeting attendance. So these are little nudges, all related to improving asynchronous communication, that remind learners or remind anyone that behavior change takes practice, and it takes implementing those changes in your daily work life. And often you can forget about them if you're not reminded about them.
That is great. And I think the fact that it is within your ecosystem, within already your communication ecosystem, I think that's very strong. Have you tested it already in those platforms?
Yeah. So we tested it in various ways. So we had a pilot. We had several teams go through a pilot program, and had some really great learnings from that pilot program. So we've tested the various iterations of it, and we're really excited for this particular learning experience, because it really does meet the needs of the learners that we've worked with, as well as some of the teams that we've been working with for this particular product. So we're excited because we keep hearing over and over again that teams and individuals just don't have time. They don't have time for learning something new. And we have all sorts of programs that vary in length. But the feedback that we get a lot from organizations that end up maybe not working with us is that there's just not enough time. There's not enough time to dedicate to learning something new. And while, of course, that has all sorts of red flags associated with it, if there's a huge shift in work happening and team members aren't given the time that they need to make that adjustment, I mean, that's definitely not, it doesn't bode well for a successful transition. But understanding that there are so many demands on individuals, there are so many demands on all of us. And if we can pare down exactly what people need to know and demonstrate that small changes and small investments in learning a new skill can have big impacts, then we are happy to meet that need. And meet that change in how the market really sees learning and development.
Yeah, and I think it's brilliant that you're doing small changes of behavior. You're nudging them along in small bits throughout the day in their ecosystem. I think that's the best way of learning. So you mentioned already, just to start wrapping up, Tammy, but you mentioned already one of the goals that somebody might have, like reducing the amount of time in meetings. You've got 3 other explicit goals that you've named. So that was one, reducing the amount of time spent in synchronous meetings. What other goals can people have?
Sure. So another goal is increasing the amount and quality of uninterrupted deep work time. So having time in your day to really focus and spend on deep focused work. And then another goal is reducing reliance on other people's time to gain access to information. This is a key one. So improving documentation, basically, and improving individual documentation and team documentation. It's really one of the best ways to not only improve productivity, but also improve equitable outcomes for team members. Because if you improve access to information, that means that everyone has access to that information. And information is power. And so often some of the complaints that come from hybrid teams or teams that are really resistant to remote work is the idea or the preconceived notion that you're going to be left out of discussions, you're going to be left out of the loop, as it were, when you don't work in the office. And by having a really robust documentation culture, you can eliminate some of that concern because you're actually making that information more accessible.
That's a real challenge. I found this is the documentation aspect. There's usually a lot of resistance because we're not used to it. So I think this is really interesting. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, well, and to that point too, there's resistance because people feel like there's already too much documentation, and they feel like they have to read too much. People aren't reading emails, and there's a lot that goes into that. But that's not necessarily the right kind of documentation, right? So they're using email as a documentation tool, and that is the opposite of accessible because the only people that have access to that information are the people that were included on the email. So anyway, there's that. And then also another goal is to reduce interruptions by setting clear expectations for others on responsiveness. So we talk about setting really clear boundaries, having a communication charter, understanding what type of message needs immediate or rapid response and what type of message doesn't need a rapid response. I mean, that's a fundamental question that most teams never, ever have.
Great. That is, I can't think of anything else to look at when you're looking at introducing async and also introducing that balance between the synchronous and asynchronous communication. And I think listeners that even if you don't end up working with the Placeless Coach, all of this is really important to be addressing, going right back to our earlier conversation about having conversations around mindset, the infrastructure, etc. All of this starts to say, okay, well, how are we going to make sure we have enough information? How are we going to set the expectations around responsiveness, etc.? So thank you very much, Tammy. Anything else that will be of interest for our listeners to know around what you are doing, either within the company or with this coach in particular?
I think we covered a lot. I mean, I'm glad that we spent this conversation focusing on the problems because that really is what this solution is about. We created this because there is a definite need for building really comfort around adopting more asynchronous communication. And education is definitely, I believe, one of the best ways to improve any kind of outcome, and especially with just a general understanding and comfort and the language that is used to talk about this. That's just a few of the things that we want to accomplish with this product is give people that shared language so that they can talk about the things that work and the things that don't work, so they can iterate and continue to improve.
Wonderful. So we'll send listeners to workplaceless.com/microlearning. Is that the right URL?
That's the right one.
Excellent. And if listeners want to say hello to you individually, Tammy, where is the best place online to find you?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Tammy Bjelland, Tammy Bjelland. And that is also my handle on Twitter.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Tammy. It's been so great to finally get to talk to you properly for a while.
Yes, this has been great, Pilar. Thanks so much for having me.
A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.